country. So I acknowledge this land that we meet on today is the traditional lands of the Kaurna people, and we pay respect to their spiritual relationship with this country. We also would like to acknowledge the Kaurna people as the custodians of the Adelaide region, and their cultural and heritage beliefs are still as important to the living Kaurna people today. And I'd also like to pay respects to the Cultural Authority of Aboriginal people who are, visiting or attending this Zoom session today. And I now welcome you to pay your respects and acknowledgement to the country that you are on in the chat box, if you wish. Okay. So I'm going to introduce our two speakers for our event today. So we have Miss Kerry Bond, who is an associate lecturer, academic learning advisor and access coordinator with CQ University's School of Access Education. She has been teaching in biosciences for 20 years. And Kerry's background is in science education, and educational psychology, including brain-based learning approaches. I'm very, very interested in this. And then we also have Dr. Michelle Vanderberg, who is a senior lecturer with CQ University's School of Education and in the Arts. She received her PhD in language and literacy and has worked with kindergarten to year 12, K-12 teachers and higher education institutions to develop instructional language and literacy methods in the classroom. Both Kerry and Michelle are currently involved in an interdisciplinary research project aiming to improve bioscience vocabulary learning in nursing students with the support of educational technology. So I now warmly welcome Kerry and Michelle to start their presentation. We are all very eager to hear your findings and your research.
Thanks very much for that welcome, Tiana. Michelle's going to be handling our slides today, so hopefully we'll be able to keep up with one another. And apologies if I cough. I've had that boomerang, what they call the yo-yo flu, so if I cough, I apologise. I don't know what people's backgrounds are here, whether everyone is coming from a language literacy sort of background. I'm conscious that coming from a science background, it's not my first area, but what we do know is the development of literacy is a really complex phenomenon, and it of course begins before school ever does, with exposure to language use at home. And literacy levels that our adult learners bring with them are comprised of years of various interactions and practices, which may be extensive or not, correct or not, and we essentially have the job of meeting our students where they're at. So if we could go on. Oh, sorry, I didn't add to the chat, but just hi from Yuwabura country up here in Mackay, by the way. Okay. So Michelle and I are, as Tiana mentioned, part of a larger team that's engaged in a funded project around helping nursing students learn bioscience language, specifically, because it's a real challenge in nursing education. It seems to be one of those hurdle points for nursing students, and it can be a contributor to their attrition. What you see on the screen is a bit of a mouthful, so we tend to just call it the Biolexicon project. But the strategies we've attempted to integrate into the technology we've used, which is actually an app prototype we've developed, are based on second language learning approaches and also our current understandings of how the brain learns language and just learns generally. So I tend to run learning strategy workshops here. We'll mention the technology that we're using a bit more towards the end, and some people may be interested in trialling some ideas using their own learning management system, but we'll mainly focus on the pedagogy today so that it's more accessible for everyone. So keep in mind again that I'm a science teacher by trade, not a linguistics specialist, and I'm always looking for ways to support biology students in the challenge of picking up all those massive words. Again, Michelle is our language specialist on the team. We were hoping to have Katrina with us today, but she had something else on, but she was our digital media and tech specialist. So as you can see, our team is made up of quite a diverse range of researchers from 5 different schools, and that diversity brings quite a bit to our table. So you probably get some kind of idea. Oh, actually, you can't see it from the school. So we've got School of Access Education, engineering technology, education, and with Michelle, linguistics, and nursing, and the anatomy and physiology is in human biosciences. Okay, so in a nutshell, we're exploring a second language acquisition pedagogical approach, as I mentioned, to learning disciplinary language that we hope will contribute ultimately to nursing student retention. So most students learn disciplinary content, including the language of a discipline, by reading and writing. Inevitably, when I speak to students and I say, they say, I need help with my study. I say, well, what are you doing? And inevitably I hear, I'm reading, I'm copying down notes, I'm highlighting. They might be doing a few quizzes or something that their lecturers do, but beyond that, that's about it. And just copying notes is really shallow level of processing, but it also isn't good for being able to speak the vocabulary of a language, particularly if you're in a discipline where you need to use it for clinical placement, like in nursing. So different disciplines will have more of a or less of a demand for the verbal proficiency, but nursing certainly is quite high in that area. So being able to speak to with other professionals when nursing students go on prac, and indeed any discipline where there's some kind of prac element, if the students are confident with the language and speaking it, that increases their self-efficacy, and that also contributes to overall success. We know in the case of nursing, the students who are successful on their placement are actually less likely to attrite. I'm trying to not go on too much. I'm going to skip a couple of things. Okay, so we might just move on, just so we're not focusing on nursing too much. So essentially what we're looking at, rather than just focusing on the reading and the writing, we wanted to get students practicing speaking the language, but also being able to recognise the language through audition. So being able to, when they hear it in a sentence or hear it by itself, recognise it. What I found in my learning advisor work as a science learning advisor with nursing students is that students could recognise a word on paper, but then when I asked them to speak about it, they would stumble and they'd be so self-conscious and they had no idea how to pronounce these big words, and yet they needed to be able to do that. So we decided to incorporate that into our intervention, and it's obviously not quite as simplistic as this flowchart indicates, but we figured that adding this sort of element would be just one spoke in the wheel that rolls towards success. Other things to consider for all of you when you're doing consolidation questions around academic language is not just what to test, but how to test. And I might just actually move on from there, Michelle. I'll just give you a minute to read this because I love this quote. So I think this statement is true for all students as they go through university and later enter their professional communities. Disciplinary language is a social professional gift. And I'm sure you've all got some experiences that you could probably share around that. But for disciplinary language learning, what we found in the research is that the value is placed really on second language acquisition approaches, which is what we had suspected, technology to embed pedagogies, which is what we've tried to do, both using an app and also using our university's learning management system, using a focus on oral language and student feedback, and also providing opportunities for valuable, extensive practice, and that includes in lots of circumstances. So when we transfer any information, the more practice we get in the variety of circumstances is ideal for transfer of learning. The app prototype that we've created also provides all of that with flexibility in access, a little bit of gamification, not quite as much as we'd hoped, but it also is an opportunity for students to review those words with no consequences, no embarrassment, sort of opportunities to practice recognising and speaking the language. For anyone who doesn't, who's interested, Frank Smith is a Canadian psycholinguist, and he's made a lot of contributions to linguistics and cognitive psychology. So I might just hand over to Michelle, and she's going to invite you to share.
Yeah, so some of the things that Carrie was talking about, well, if we have time today, we have a lot to cover that we want to cover, but if we have time, we'll kind of share a little bit more about the app that we've created to help our nursing students. But we wanted to open this up to more broader disciplines, and because I know that a lot of you are teaching to different disciplines. Academic literacy, absolutely, that is definitely a core. So what I'd like you to do is kind of share a little bit in the next couple few minutes. My first question is like disciplinary literacy. What does this mean to you? And this can be like, can you define it, or can you share experiences of what examples of what disciplinary literacy might mean? And you're welcome to use the chat, or hopefully someone will say something out loud, but I'd really like to try to get some people to share. What do you guys think?
You'd like to share your own experience of engaging with that? What disciplines are you all engaging with when you teach disciplinary literacy?
I'll start. Can you hear me?
Yep, thanks, Steve.
With the nature of our job at Melbourne Uni, we engage with multidisciplinary, cross-disciplinary students from all different disciplines. So this notion of discipline-specific literacy, I think, is really, it's really important, because for me, it just means that it's a multi-pronged thing. It's I guess it's hard to sort of pin it down to one single area, because literacy is such a wide concept, but it's knowing and understanding and using and getting into the discourse, which means the vocab, the language, but also the perspectives and angles that the discipline takes and the expectations of the discipline. So, for example, you know, when we're working with humanities students, we might be talking about cohesion and compounding of ideas. And when we're talking with engineering or science students, we will be doing less of that, because that might be a bit more of a clipped way of presenting ideas. So I think there's something very tangible about disciplinary literacy, but there's also something intangible and also sort of, you know, underlying expectations around it, which I think comes with experience and understanding around the discipline. But the final thing I want to say, because I think I'm going on a bit too long, is that those things aren't set in concrete, you know, because just because you're a scientist or an engineer, you don't have to explain yourself in clipped tones or sentences less than 15 words. Like, there's no rules around it, right? And it is contextually dependent, but I think it's those type of understandings, I think.
Yeah, great. Rose, I like what Rosemary says in the chat too, that knowing the purposes of the communication. I think communication is a key here on the disciplinary literacy ideas. Tiana?
Can I add to that, Michelle? I've just come out of a meeting with health, and even internally, their ideas of what a briefing paper are vary. So it's very much about knowing what exactly is the purpose, what exactly is the audience, and helping people make sense of whatever that piece of communication is.
Absolutely. Yeah. Because even like I try to, you know, I'm a researcher, so I try to publish, and depending on the journal I'm going for, it's going to look a little different, or it might have a different type of setup in my sentence structure and language and things like that. Anna?
Hi. I find myself explaining it to students at the start of the semester, especially the new students when they come in, and we have to explain it to the staff as well. We describe it as the way we do things here. We often use discourses, you know, with a capital D, and we explain how different they can be. And students seem to really relate to that. So I say, here we are in the Faculty of Education at a large Australian university in 2023. So this is how we do things in education. And it's probably applies to everyone from pathway students to PhD students. So I think it's pretty helpful to think about it. As I say, it's like a foreign language for all of us. And it's something for us to learn. Yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you. Tiana?
I had a instance a few years ago where I was helping my previous supervisor put a course together, which was actually Latin and Greek for health and medical science students. And it was very, you know, obviously discipline specific. And then he had a few history and classics students who came into it. Now, obviously, if you're a classics and ancient history student, you need to know Latin. You know, you need to know certain phrases and words in order to understand things. It's crucial to translations. And we had an instance with the library where the library started throwing away these books that were in the Latin or the Greek translation, and they're called Lurbs. And they said, oh, but you've got the Penguin translations, it's fine. And we said, no, those Penguin translations, that they don't have the same, it's not the same words, they're translated differently, it's for a general audience. We need that specialist disciplinary language. And we also found with this course that we created for health and medical science students, one of the task assessments is to pick a word that's in, you know, health or scientific literature, a specific Greek or Latin term, and, you know, write about the history of that word to understand the contexts that come behind it, that, you know, how it's been interpreted over the years, how it's changed, and some of those issues, and found that, you know, a lot of the feedback from the course, especially from nursing students and science students, was that they really, really enjoyed it because it gave them a deeper understanding of language and how these words came to be, and they could incorporate that into their practice. So I think it's, quite important to know about this.
Can I just add, I don't know if anyone has seen that Mel Gibson movie on the history of, you know, how the dictionary got created, but they actually explored all of the history of the words, which I think was fascinating. But I just wanted to add as well, which ties into some of the other things that people have said, the different genres, purposes, all that kind of thing. With nursing students as an example, and any health, allied health, if you're working in a particular discipline, you may use one set of language for working with colleagues, but you may have to translate that into a different level of language, which we will touch on today, for another audience. So if you're a nurse talking with a doctor, you'll be using different language than if you're talking to a patient or their family. So there's that aspect, that translation kind of element to language in disciplines that I think we can support with students as well.
Absolutely. And if you look up a definition of disciplinary literacy, they talk about reading, writing, communicating, you know, those core things, a lot of what you guys are expanding on, but it's not as simple as that, as Steve kind of brought up, you know, but we need to focus in on some of the tools and the skills. And as some of you have already started to talk about, is that terminology specific language. And that's kind of what we're focusing in on today. And just having the students understand that there's this academic terminology that they need to learn. So to continue a discussion, I actually have a little Mentimeter, if you guys don't mind. I'm going to, I can share the link so another way for you to share your ideas. But I'm going to be presenting this. So the first thing you can do, you can go to menti.com or click on that link that I just put in the chat. And we'll go on to the first question. So the first question I would love for you to answer is, describe any issues or concerns. Ooh, my spelling is horrible. You have with teaching terminology. So describe any issues or concerns you have with teaching terminology, and you can put some of those concerns in there, and this is kind of an anonymous way to do that. Or you can maybe speak some out if you want to share once you type something in. Not being an expert in the field, I feel that deeply because I am the literacy expert, and at the moment I'm going into STEM and teaching a lot about digital literacy and just hardware and STEM, computer, all this sort of technical stuff that I'm still learning and helping my students understand that. And it's kind of interesting to do. Does anyone want to speak out on any one of these? Yeah, that one that just came up, the terminology with different meanings in different fields, we'll kind of touch on that today. Because we do have, I know as an American moving to Australia, I thought it was going to be easy because we all speak the same language, but there are words here that are completely different. Or my biggest example is tea. I never know. Is it morning tea, afternoon tea, dinner, a drink? I never know. So, we have these same words, but they're used in different ways.
The same thing when I lived in the States, and it was, you had to be careful of the word thong, of course. And
yes, I still can't say that.
And some of our sayings in Australia, people just look at me very politely and blankly, and
right.
Yeah.
So that's kind of building on, we'll be talking about some of those things today too. And there's too many words. Any other thoughts on some concerns that you're having? And I'm sure some of you see similar concerns. The next one is kind of talking about what strategies have you used to teach disciplinary or academic terminology? Do you have any good ideas that you found have worked with your students? It's always good to share some good teaching ideas.
Too many? How?
Okay, well, Anna, give me an example of something that you found that worked well.
Oh, look, yeah, I'll try to put it in. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Metaphors. Yeah, metaphors is really good. Giving that comparison, something that they already know, or analogies definitely is kind of the same thing. So giving those different perspectives, different examples that they can kind of see. I love the storytelling idea. Just something, because we do tell stories. We like to tell stories. We like to watch stories. We like to see stories, and having them kind of connect these ideas, these complex ideas or terms to that is really good. Excellent. Etymology, we'll be talking about that in a little bit. Good. Yep. Nice job. So we have lots of different, I'm sure you have lots of different things to share with each other, and I hope, continue using the chat if you want to come up with other ideas, or keep on this Mentimeter, and we'll see if we have any more ideas. So let's go back. Let me go back to the PowerPoint really quick. Okay, and what's next? So Carrie's going to do a little example of something that's kind of fun.
Okay, can I get you all just to put in the chat a yes or a no, whether or not you know this word, if you're familiar with it? Well, there's at least one yes in there. Okay, I just want to check to make sure it's kind of unfamiliar to the majority of you. Those of you who said yes, and there are a couple of you, can you tell me, would you be confident in pronouncing that to the whole group at this point in time?
Sure, I can go. Hi, everyone. It's Ho'oponopono.
Very good. Okay, and can I ask where you encountered the word?
It is a technique that I have encountered I'm interested in spirituality, metaphysics, and things like that. So in my research in the field, I've come across this Hawaiian technique.
Yes. And in fact, it comes from a lot of self-help stuff. Again, spirituality, connection with the universe, self-reflection, all that kind of stuff. And one thing I just want everyone to think about, I want you actually all to learn how to say this, just to put yourselves in the shoes of your students. And again, I chose it because probably the majority of people are going to be unfamiliar with it. And when you first look at it, there are an awful lot of O's in that word, which can be a little bit daunting because it's not typically what we see in English, right? So I want you to think about, if you come across a word that you're unfamiliar with, what kinds of things help you to make sense of it if you have to be able to read it, spell it, pronounce it, use it in a sentence? So what kinds of things help you? And feel free to share in the chat if there are things that you think help you when you're looking at a new word? Yep, so prefixes, suffixes, good. Syllable stress, absolutely. So the second version of ho'oponopono is actually not the spelling, of course, it's just showing you where to put the emphasis. Yeah.
Can we say one out loud, Kerry?
Yeah, for sure, go for it.
I have a really funny one, maybe because I'm neurodivergent, it's just how my brain works. But when I was learning Latin and learning vocabulary, there was one that was, and I explained it to students sometimes about trying to imagine something, you know, a little bit tangible to make it funny in your head, and then you can remember it. And the way that I remember the verb to run in Latin, it's celare, C-E-L-A-R-E, is I imagine myself running with a celery stick.
Yep. So that association.
Celery, and I'm like, yep, there's an association there, and I've never been able to forget it ever since.
Yeah, and actually association is something I use when I teach biology for some concepts, because it just it can help memory, quite frankly. So just I don't know if anyone else wants to share anything, but some other things, hopefully when I say some of these things, they might make you think, oh yeah, actually I do use that. So one of the things, as you can see in the image, there's a ukulele there. This young lady is Hawaiian. So Shri, I think, mentioned that it was Hawaiian, and indeed it is. So sometimes when we know the cultural origins of a word, that can help us kind of know whether or not, say, a CH is a ch or a kut, or a C, in fact, as an example, encephalitis, or some people say encephalitis, whether you say a kut or a s, it depends on whether you're coming from the French or the Latin, the Greek origins of the word. So the cultural origins can give us a bit of a clue. The other thing is seeing where the emphasis is on the syllables. Another thing can be hearing it pronounced by someone who's already proficient, but the speed at which that's done can make a difference as to how quickly we pick it up. So often it's better for us to hear it slowly first, and then get our heads around the different parts of the word, and then pick that up. So can I just get you forward to the, yeah, so there's also the meaning behind it. So we will talk about etymology, or Michelle will. So in this particular word, ho'o means to make, and then pono means right. So the double pono means to make things right with yourself and with other people. So it's a making right between yourself and essentially the world. Now there's this particular audio, it was the best one I could find, but it's actually quite soft. So apologies if that's tricky to hear. And I'll just zoom. That's very soft. I think I have to have my computer on max for that to be audio, so it's a bit. But this is a Hawaiian guy he's genuinely Hawaiian. He pronounces it ho'oponopono. But when I first encountered this word, I was thinking, how on earth do you pronounce that? Because I read it. And then as you become more familiar with it and you hear someone else say it, again, if you slow it down, ho'oponopono, and then practice, you can become faster and more proficient with time. Our brain actually is like, when we learn something, it's like the first time we bit a track through a bush. The first, if we just go once, you know, you could probably never tell that anyone's been there. But if you repeat going through that same pathway, eventually a wider and wider pathway will be marked. And our brain is very similar in that the more we repeat something, our neural pathways actually become more firm. Literally, physically, they become more solid. You get changes in the brain to cement that pathway in place. So the way we help ourselves create those pathways effectively can include a range of things, like the cultural origins, looking at where these syllables are emphasized, hearing it pronounced correctly, and looking at those background meanings. Now, let me just check if anyone's added. So prefixes, suffixes can also add to that etymology. And then the other things can be whether or not, what type of word part it is. So is it a noun? Is it a verb? Is it an action word? Is it an adverb? Now, this particular word can be used in a few different ways. Typically, when it's translated, it is used as a noun. So an example would be some Hawaiian practitioners provide ho'oponopono to clients who otherwise might seek family counselling. So hearing it in a context can also help, and knowing that sort of thing. We might move on. Yep. And then Michelle's going to take you through.
So I'm a teacher educator. That's primarily my job, is to teach future teachers. And a lot of the times I tell them, you know, we've all been in classrooms. We all think we know what teaching is all about, but we don't always know why teachers do the things that they do. And we really need to understand some of the theoretical ideas around teaching, and the theories behind how people learn and why we teach the way we do. So we've got to do a little bit of theory right now, just to kind of introduce you to some big ideas around language learning and terminology, so that you have a little bit of understanding of why the things why the strategies that we are promoting work. So we found this that kind of talks a little bit, going back to that disciplinary literacy. It's a nice little graphic that kind of talks about all the different things that should be considered with critical disciplinary literacy. So that's just different disciplinary thinking, knowledge building, and how to help students read and write and listen and speak in different ways. What we're focusing in on today is more that discussion idea, the idea to hear, to speak more, that terminology to help them do more than just be able to read and write it, because that speaking and listening really helps cement their knowledge of this new terminology that they need. And, you know, just kind of looking at some of those academic language and vocabulary concepts that we'll be covering today. So one thing is that's helpful to understand is that terminology has been theoretically divided into 3 different tiers. So the first one is just the basic words that we typically use on a day-to-day basis. In conversation, you know, everyone kind of knows them, and we're very familiar with those words. Tier 2 words, those are those high utility for mature language users. So that's more the academic language that we all want our students to be able to use at university level. We want them to use, you know, words like precede or contradict or, you know, synthesize, those sorts of words, so that they understand, and that's more common across the disciplines. But then you also have the tier 3 words, and those are more specialized. So those are like in the nursing field or the medical field, they have specialized terminology that they need to know. In the business world or accounting or historians, things like that, teaching, there's discipline specific words that are probably only used in those sorts of areas. So that's important to understand, to help students or help you understand that, you know, words or terminology can be divided into different ways. And we're mostly focusing in on helping them learn those tier 2 and tier 3 words. There's also a theoretical understanding that when we learn words, it's typically maybe in different stages. Like there's words that we've never seen before and we have no idea what they are. There's words that, yeah, I think I've heard that before, but I don't quite know what that means. Or those words that, yep, if I read it in a sentence within context, or I hear it within a certain context, I'll be able to understand. It might be a kind of unfamiliar word to me, but I'll be able to pick up and infer what it means. And then there's that stage 4 that we know it really well. When I look at this theoretical idea, I always think about my sister-in-law, because my sister-in-law is very well read. In the United States, we have these GREs, these tests to get into graduate school. She always got perfect scores on the language section, perfect scores. And that's really, really difficult to do. When my husband was working towards his PhD and he had to take the GRE, he asked her, can you tutor me? Can you help me? And so they would look at questions and she would tell him, yep, it's that one. Or, you know, looking at multiple choice question, yep, it's that one. And he's like, how do you know? I don't know, I just know. And she would be right every single time. And I think because she's heard it, but she doesn't quite know what it means, but she's been exposed to all these different words. And I think that's actually what sometimes these theoretical leaders kind of tell us is that we have to help our students read. The more that they're reading, the more that they're exposed to, the better that they will be able to infer meaning and grab it into within the context of what they are. So I'm going to go over to Carrie to go over a few other theoretical ideas.
Part of the basis behind our intervention in our study was really looking at how we get information into our brains and then how we bring it out. So what we call encoding to bring it into our long-term memory, and then decoding to pull it out. So when we short-term memory, I'll just mention there, is often used interchangeably with working memory, although there are some people who would say they're two different things. But really, our students often are just recalling facts or particular words. So we often see them. Oh, can you just click once, please, Michelle? Yeah, so we see this explicit memory often cultivated with our student, as opposed to the implicit memory that Michelle's sister-in-law had demonstrated. But one of the key ideas behind our students hearing words and being encouraged to say them out loud is for them to recognize keywords via auditory channels. And the way we encode information is using our 5 senses. So that's part of our encoding, but we need to pay attention to our different senses and the way that we're bringing information in. And then the way our working memory works with that information will determine how it's encoded in long-term memory. And then that also influences how it's decoded and brought back out again. So we wanted our students to be able to recognize words that are spoken, but also to develop the procedural memory, which is, you can see over on the right of the screen, which is often not addressed by consolidation practices, by revision practices. Often students are just reading and writing, and if they're mumbling to themselves, they're often looked at strangely, but in fact, speaking out loud is really important, which Michelle will cover later. So procedural, any procedural memory that we have tends to involve practice, things we're doing, and it might be the procedure of how to do a mathematical equation, or it can be a physical thing like how to throw a ball, or in this case, how to actually form your mouth to pronounce certain words, like ho'oponopono, or in the case of the biosciences, some pretty long different combinations of Latin and Greek. So this is an important addition to what students are doing, and that's what we're trying to target in addition to the normal pedagogy used. This slide here, well, I'm not going to play this video, but this is a really interesting little clip on how speech movements are actually controlled by a brain. And what we're going to do at the end of today is give you a resource sheet, a file that you can download, and it will have all these media links on there, as well as some other resources and bibliography of some interesting things you might like to take a look at. So just be aware that that is something that you can look into later. This is what I would like to show you, again, kind of sitting behind why we're doing what we're doing, understanding that, again, reading and writing will use certain parts of the brain. When we speak and when we listen, those use different parts of the brain again. So we're trying to use more of the brain when we use these pedagogies. So if anyone is interested in how speech movements, so I just don't want anyone to feel overwhelmed by this image, but just look at the colors. So the blue region is involved in auditory differentiation of sounds. So picking the differences or the comprehension of speech. And again, that's not always targeted in disciplinary language learning or consolidation. Information is processed there and then links to the green region, which is the Broca's area. And again, that's different to just reading and writing. So this is the part of the brain that ramps up when it's planning for speech. And so the blue and the green regions also link to other brain regions that are involved in comprehension. So although language functions of the brain are really networked and actually quite complex, a simple explanation here is that the green area, the Broca's area, is involved in the production of language, including movement of the tongue and mouth, which then extends to processes that occurred before speaking. And the app that we've developed provides opportunities for language recognition. And then because we don't have speech recognition capability in it, we've prompted speech production so that those other areas of the brain would be used, and then coupled that with traditional methods of bioscience learning. Now, we didn't have speech recognition in the app, but we have found that learning management systems that probably most of us will use have that capability. So through H5P, so we'll mention that a bit later. Now I'll just play 1 minute of this. These are the areas of the brain that are involved in interpretation of heard language, such as the auditory cortex and Wernicke's area, and the speech production, which is the Broca's area. And they're connected to, again, those other brain areas related to comprehension. So if you could just press play, and then Michelle, if you could just stop at 2 minutes 49.
What are the specific areas of the brain that are responsible for this capacity? Two critical regions are called Broca's area and Wernicke's area. The first of these is responsible for the motor functions that allow us to formulate syllables with our mouths, since damage to this area results in impairment of this function without affecting the ability to understand language. The second area is the one that is responsible for the understanding of language, since damage to this region does not impair the ability to vocalize, but results in complete nonsense being spoken. These two regions, together with the basal nuclei, form a language implementation system that analyzes words that are heard and produces our own speech in response. A surrounding set of cortical areas links this system with other regions of the cortex that are responsible for conceptualization of ideas, essentially enabling us to communicate our thoughts.
Thanks for that, Michelle. So if we can just be aware that we have the link to that also on that resource sheet that we'll give to you at the end. If we can go to the next slide, if that's okay.
This highlights the features of language.
Michelle will take over from the and talk about cognitive load. I don't know if how many of you are familiar with that, but she'll take it from you.
So Carrie started talking a little bit about working memory. So working memory is the idea that in our heads, you know, we have only so much that we can do, really. I kind of relate it to computers. So when you have a computer, and you open a screen, and then you open another screen, and then you open another tab, and you have like 50 or 60 tabs open on your computer, or different documents open at the same time. What usually happens to your computer? Kind of slows things down, right? Or it crashes, or something. And that's kind of what our brains are. If we have too many things that we have to think about at the same time, we're overextending our working memory use. So we have to help our students sometimes. So I used to teach English, high school English, and when we would read, like say Shakespeare or something like that, and I wanted my students to summarize a section or write about that, to reduce their working memory, I would write the names of the characters on the board, so that they wouldn't have to worry about trying to remember those characters, because I wasn't trying to analyze how they can memorize characters' names. I wanted to know how they can synthesize a story, summarize a story. So you can help your students or just understand that, what do they really need to know, and how can you help them reduce that strain on their working memory. So some things that you can do is talk to them about the tiers of terminology, talk to them about helping them chunk new information, including that auditory component like Carrie was talking about, using images with that speaking and things like that, and then teach them about code switching. And I think this is really important as well. I was actually interviewing some of our medical students earlier today for another research project, and they were talking about how they're struggling learning how to talk like a doctor, and how they have to talk like the people that live in Bundaberg who are their patients. They have to switch that, and that's code switching. We all do it. We all do some form of code switching. We talk differently to our best friends than we do to our boss or our grandmother, you know, things like that. We use different words or different expressions, or we use the same sorts of words, but just in different ways. So that's an ability, I think, that we need to help our students understand that this is what you need to do. This is how you're learning this terminology, or you're learning this different way of writing, speaking, listening, talking, but you have to learn how to transfer those skills. And that is a skill. We have to learn how to understand how to switch. And that's what code switching is. So switching between those tiers and things like that. And yeah, Steve said it's just as important as learning the terminology is knowing how to switch like that. Do any of you have any examples of when you have code switched? Anyone want to share anything like that? Like, do you remember a time where you talked differently in different ways to different people? Or even wrote?
I think we do it all the time, Michelle, in daily life constantly, depending on who we're talking to. But from looking at it from the other side, one of the things I think that medical people often talk about is the inability of beginning medical practitioners to be able to code switch depending on the audience they're talking to. So, you know, talking to an 8-year-old kid who's got a serious illness as if they were an adult, you know, and not knowing why the kid's getting upset or the parents are stepping in. And I was talking to some of the medical academics in our medical faculty, and they said it's a real issue. They have to teach them how to do that.
That's definitely a skill. And yeah, I think that's important to say, is you have to teach this as well. So that's why I think it's important to talk about it. There's a thing called code switching, and, you know, and explain that to them and try to teach that skill.
But I also think it's taken the medical discipline a long time to understand that. It's like, we don't need to teach it. You just go out and do it, right?
Yeah, no, it's a skill.
I think it's only
skill.
Yeah, right. I think it's only relatively recently that, at least at Melbourne, they've really they've taken that on as a thing they need to work with and teach.
That's great. That's good then. Positive step forward. Emma?
So it just occurred to me that the workshop I mentioned before, where we're, you know, talking to students about understanding the purpose of communication, applying principles in context, etc. As part of that workshop, we explicitly tell students that the way they present information, including the language that they use, should be determined by their audience. And we give them specific examples of, you know, this is how you would frame information, both in terms of detail and language for this audience, this audience, this audience. And I've also just realized that I do this all the time in my teaching, because I'm teaching first-year health and medical science students. And I did a bachelor's degree in arts. I have a philosophy major. I did philosophy honors. I came into public health as an ethicist. And so I find myself using the plain language explanation and then the technical term for my students, and moving between highly technical and very sort of conversational language all the time in my classes.
Can I add too that I think that when we do that, I think when we empathise with the student, knowing they don't really have a grasp of the meanings of these highfalutin words of the discipline sometimes, but we make those connections with their prior knowledge. That's really important as a teacher, to think, what does my student already get? We get what is their foundation that they already know that we can put a brick on top of, rather than trying to put a brick in midair that's going to fall. So analogy I use with my students. When we tap into what's the language they're currently using, how would they describe it, and try and use that, I think that can help. And again, using, someone else mentioned this as well, using metaphors and analogies can sometimes just conceptually help people to connect.
All right, yeah, great ideas. And I'm just reading some of the chat, some of your things that you're putting in the chat. This is excellent. Really important skill to learn. So we're gonna switch over. Thank you for listening to our theoretical ideas, but we do want to share some teaching and learning approaches. So I think Carrie's gonna go with this first one.
Thanks, Michelle. So we've really embraced talking as a partial solution to disciplinary competence and dialogic pedagogies, including things like collaborative learnings, like problem-based learning. So our idea is that we want to capitalise on the power of talking to learn under particular conditions. And that has the dialogic pedagogies that are typically used in synchronous or everyone there at the same time, tutorials and things like that. They promote engagement. They promote students' abilities to think and learn. They promote critical thinking. They promote metacognition and self-reflection. And there have also been studies finding that students have lower stress levels and a more positive effect towards their learning when they have dialogic approaches. Research has also demonstrated that integrating bioscience education with nursing or clinical practice is beneficial to apply bioscience concepts to patient conditions. So that's in a bioscience example. But the problem, of course, that most of us would realise in this online, particularly post-COVID world, is that while synchronous tutorials are the ideal place to embrace those dialogic pedagogies where everyone chats and problem solves together and talks the talk, one of the problems is that a lot of our students are studying online. They're not necessarily accessing synchronous learning experiences. And so they're accessing the learning experiences and resources asynchronously. So they're sitting in this silo by themselves, watching a lecture after 11 o'clock at night, or going through materials that are on Moodle all by themselves. So they're not engaging in those conversations. And so what we wanted to do with the app was try to provide a next best option for those students who are learning independently. So a research project really aims to provide mobile, flexible, asynchronous learning opportunities for students that actually complement what ideally would be experienced as dialogic learning approaches. And they're what I used in the unit that we're actually studying. They do use dialogic approaches in their tutorials, but the tutors also try and use etymology to help students become familiar with pronunciation and word recognition. And again, there's not really any substitute for that. So we're looking at a next best option. So again, the tutorials are when students come together. As many of them as possible are invited or sort of pushed to come. They use a lot of case studies, which means that students are exploring the language, hopefully getting that experience of code switching between if they had a conversation with a colleague versus if they had to use that language with a patient or gain it. If they're trying to get information that's medical from a patient, they can't say, use technical language, has your blah, 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 and medical language been doing this, or this. They need to be asking questions that are intelligible to the patient. So these kind of dialogic approaches do help students connect new words to meanings. And again, etymology is taught, so the patterns in word prefixes and suffixes are starting to be recognisable and less threatening. I'm going to hand over to Michelle to talk a bit more about etymology.
Yeah, so several of you have already brought up etymology a bit, learning those prefixes, those Latin roots, the Greek roots. It's really important. So etymology is the study of the origin and history of words, where they come from. And like Carrie started to say, patterns. Our brains love patterns. We like to see those different patterns. And so when we can start to learn these, and sometimes you just got to study these, sometimes you just got to get to know them. And encouraging our students to do that, because a lot of the words that we use, and I try to find examples other than just medical or bioscience, because that's what our project was about, but there's even words, that we use in our academic language or that we want our students to use in their writing, that if they get to know the Latin and Latin roots, Greek roots, then they can start to develop those or see those patterns in the different words that they're exposed to and that we want them to use. In the resource that we have that we're going to provide to you, there's some good common Latin and Greek roots linked to that, and then there's a couple academic word lists that people have come to used lots of different research to find some good academic word lists, and we found a few. Cox Head does a really good academic word list, and then Gardner and Davies has like an updated or a newer type of academic word list. And so they're really good resources to go to to just find different words that you can maybe help students understand in academic language. There's also just a little bit more on the just understanding those patterns, those prefixes and suffixes is really helpful. So again, when the students start to see that there's patterns in words, or they start to recognize, oh, I know what hyper means. Hyper is high. Glycemia, something to do with sugar, and anemia is blood. So putting it all together, that high blood in the sugar, or high sugar in the blood, sorry. So they start to see those word parts, and they start to break down the words, and they can start to understand what those meanings of those different words are, infer again, and start to understand what those different things are. So that's a good way to help your students, is to give them a little, some of these word lists, or at least direct them to study some of these, work on these, because it will help you understand a lot of the words and be able to see those patterns. And then going on with that is using images again. So here's an example, of that trade is a small beam, and showing them that it's like a metaphor in an image, showing them those images and how those relate, that medical term relates to that building construction term, and showing them that. And so it kind of helps you, they'll be able to remember that image when they are trying to look at the word. And that's very helpful too. So giving another example from a like a primary high school, we used to put things up on the walls, help resources up on the walls that students could use. And then in America, when we had standardized testing, we had to cover all the walls and cover those resources. But often I would see my students taking their test, and then just all of a sudden just staring at the wall. It's covered, they can't actually see it, but I know they're thinking about it in their head, and they're remembering what was up there. So those visuals are very helpful for students as well. So they might be able to do that too. Google, encourage your students to use Google. And I actually have this one. Let me see if I can find it again. So you can Google, I just Googled pronounce contradict, and this came up. Google has a great little thing here. Well, they will actually pronounce it, and you can use either the British or American pronunciation. If you play contradict, it will show you. So again, that audio, it will slow it down. Contradict. And then it looks like up and coming pretty soon, because the American version has a beta where you can practice. So if I click this, I can say it, and then it'll kind of assess how I'm doing. So again, that listening and speaking practice. So this is a really great way to encourage your students to learn how to how the words sound and how to speak it. I'm guessing that after a while we'll get that in the British pronunciation as well, that practice part. But be careful, because Carrie will say this is actually the wrong way to pronounce this word. She found this out, that she used to pronounce it like Borayman, but with that emphasis on the ray. But it's actually, then she went to a doctor, and he's like, no, we don't say that. It's Foraman, I think.
Actually, I pronounced it correctly, but then I heard this and went, oh, am I pronouncing it incorrectly all
Okay.
the time? And then I went, no, I haven't, but I really thought I was all wrong when I saw this. So yeah, it's not always correct.
So it's not always correct, just like technology is not always correct. So you do have to have like a disclaimer with that, but it's a good tool to have your students thinking about that, or using to use. And then talk out loud. So I tell my students, when you're writing a paper, read it out loud, because you'll catch your grammatical mistakes better. Talking out loud also just helps students learn it better, because we're talking about the learning and listening, but have them like explain it to themselves. Talk to a mirror and explain to yourself this concept that you're learning. Trying to use the terminology that you need to use. we've got to be careful. You don't want to be out in the public and start talking yourself out of nowhere, because people are going to think you're kind of strange. But, I always tell myself, talk to a pet, tell your pet what's going on, or talk to your partner. They might not listen, doesn't matter, just tell them, explain things so that you can get that practice in on how it should sound and how it helps you formulate your thoughts a little bit better. And actually, we found one study that shows that people who explain ideas to themselves learn almost 3 times more than those who don't. So I think that's a pretty powerful message, that we should teach our students to talk to themselves a bit and explain that concepts that they're learning and using the terminology that they're trying to learn. And then also ask themselves why. Like, explain something and then why? Oh, well, and then explain that, to try to get them to elaborate a little bit more on what they're learning about. But it's all about the speaking and talking, and just really getting like that brain-based research that Carrie was talking about, getting that to really click in our minds more than just reading and writing. So I'm going to pass it on to Carrie to talk about a little bit more strategies.
One brain-based learning approach will come as no surprise to anyone, and that is just repetition of recall. So practicing remembering stuff. It's like when you go shopping without a shopping list, or you go with your shopping list, but you try and remember as much as you can without doing that. That actually helps your memory to be reinforced. So this is just one example. If it's a subject where there's a large word list with definitions, sometimes it can be useful just to practice a mix and match activity where these can be printed out, and students should always have obviously an answer sheet somewhere, but really students should be encouraged to test themselves on language as often as possible over longer periods of time. So spread out, what we call spaced practice, other than cramming the night before, as probably most of us have tried at some point. So it should be done in a variety of ways, that revision: reading, writing, audition, speaking both by the student's self or conversationally, and lots of different contexts. To help with foundational understanding of word meanings, this kind of thing can be done that you see on the screen, where if it's printed out, students can cut it up, putting it in an envelope, and just keep it as a physical shuffle kind of pack that they can use randomly anywhere they've got a flat surface and a bit of time. And they can even time themselves, and that's part of self-regulated learning, to know what their baseline is and see if they can speed up with their recognition of words and their definitions. Students can keep records if they want to. It's really up to them. Can we just go to the next slide? Another thing that's really useful, the use of graphic organizers for learning is really, really powerful, because it uses images but also language. Now, particularly if students are talking through concepts as they're creating their own graphic organizer, like a concept map or a Venn diagram or something like that, or a table. Comparing and contrasting words that might be similar. In this first example is a biology one that students often get mixed up. So explaining the difference between those two things, using images to differentiate between them. With the second one, if I had to analyse the impact of rising nationalism on World War II, how might that differ to having to evaluate the impact of rising nationalism on World War II? So those what we call cognitive verbs these days, analyse versus evaluate, how might that change your response? In the resource list, we do actually put the QCAA list of cognitive verbs with their definitions too, if anyone's interested in that. So comparing and contrasting is often really good to be done as a guided activity before giving students any work to do by themselves. And again, different types of graphic organisers can serve different purposes. So tables, Venn diagrams are great for comparing and contrasting. Euler diagrams might show where some meanings overlap or differentiate from other terms, or can be used interchangeably. So I highly recommend experimenting with a few different graphic organisers as well. If we can just move on. One of the other things we don't cover is elaboration, which is another key learning strategy. But we do very much encourage the combination of the spoken word because you're using motor skills, procedural memory, and also audition, which is again a different part of the brain to what you use for reading and writing. But using it with images, again, also uses a different part of the brain. When you're teaching, this is something to keep in mind for your students. If you have a screen and you've got a lot of text on that screen, and then you read through that, what you're actually doing is using the same part of the brain for language processing, and it actually competes for the same space and actually lowers processing ability. So you're better off using an image and talking about that image than you are using lots and lots of text on a screen and then talking. If you use text, give your students time to read that and then perhaps move on to an image where you discuss something around that. If we can go on to the next slide, just remember dual coding is just dual like two. It's your two senses, think eyes and ears, so images and particularly spoken words, but you might even use written word with that. I probably mentioned some of these things already, but things like video clips are really powerful dual coding tools, because obviously you've got images, but someone's speaking over the top of that. So video clips are great. Just possibly watch the length of those. And you can encourage students to create things like graphic organizers, flow diagrams are another example. But again, get them to talk through out loud how and why they're connecting certain things. Things like concept maps. Why is this connected to that? And what's the action word between this node and that node? So teach them how to create a concept map. It might surprise you that students actually don't necessarily have those skills. So teaching how to do those, and then again using both eyes and ears. So if we can go on, I'll hand over back to Michelle.
Yeah, I mean, again, we've talked a little bit about this already, but just understanding that those images, those videos that, you know, Carrie was mentioning, graphic organizing, all those sorts of things, they really help with developing that meaning making for the terminology that they need to use, you know, understanding that really it helps create context to those words and to the definitions of the words and how they're used and why they're used the way they are. So it just really does help that brain idea that, you know, we have these connections, we like patterns, and our brain is using networks to make those connections and supporting the learning. Let me see, what else do I have in my notes for this? Just again, you know, that we need to help our students read widely, listen to a lot so that they can hear the words and them being used in different contexts and things like that, so that it can really develop those inferential skills where they can make inferences, you know, on what, make logical guesses basically on what those words are meaning and how to use them in different contexts. So again, just that. I'm passing back to Carrie, I think.
I just want to share one example. We might skip the next example, Michelle, after this one, just for brevity. But just as an example, you might use images. Again, you can use Google Images for prompts, and perhaps even use a particular term. Apologies to anyone who speaks German, because my pronunciation is not beautiful. But Kristallnacht is the Night of the Broken Glass, and it's a historical term, preceded World War II. And as you can see, what happened was a bit of a riot. It's often called the November pogrom, where the Nazis and a lot of people destroyed the shop fronts of Jewish businesses. Because it was really the height of anti-Semitism prior to World War II. So as an example, you might use an image and ask students to use the voice recorder on their computer or a dictaphone app on their phone. Just use 30 seconds, explain out loud everything you know about Kristallnacht and its context to World War II. Or you might, again, just get students to write, do a rapid write and write for a minute or 2 minutes, as much as they can, without trying to edit on that particular concept, using that image as a bit of a prompt. So that's just another, you can use images to prompt some activities, I suppose, that could be seen as dual coding. So if we can skip the next slide, Michelle, that was just another example, Zeitgeist.
Yeah, so going back to you, so we've shared some strategies. What have you used? Have you used any? Can you provide any examples of how you use word meanings or context to teach disciplinary language? Or have you done any of the things that we talked about, or maybe you have another suggestion? I like what Anna says. She's going to use the image-based activity in her next workshop. Any other ideas out there? I was reading through the chat, and I also liked, who was it? Emma, who said she had a lecturer who got distracted by words, interesting words, and would start to look them up like right at that moment. And that really shows a passion. And I really think that sometimes we need to do that. We need to show that we're passionate about, ooh, learning, what an interesting word, you know, I wonder where it comes from, and just kind of show that passion to kind of inspire them to like it. Joel?
Yeah, I've often used a fairly graphic description of images to explain colloquial phrases like clear as mud. I'll talk about what is it like if you dive into a creek and end up with your face in the mud. And then how do you apply that to other contexts or more theoretical uses of that phrase?
Yeah, I like it. Excellent.
I think that's really tangible for students too. They can sort of feel the mud on their faces.
Yeah, exactly. Do it. Yeah, appealing to those different senses.
That actually relates to the whole story idea as well, which is another brain-based approach. So stories, case studies, examples are good.
Mm-hmm. Anna?
I use I ask students to imagine a brick house at the start of each English language workshop, and I don't ask them to close their eyes necessarily, but then I actually link to the app. I don't know what's the best word to describe it, but we talk about the foundations, and we talk about each room in that house as being a specific English language use. And we talk about the basic house and how it can become quite uncomfortable if there are bricks missing, or it hasn't been renovated for a while, and that it's their job to actually look after that house. And if they're very comfortable, they can build an extension in the back. And, you know, and that's how they develop their language for a PhD, for example. But it seems to resonate really, really well with students. We spend quite some time on that activity because I believe I link to their metacognition. And to me, it's very, very important to take it to that next level where they reflect on their role in their English language development.
Yeah, really good. It's good to hear that there's success stories out there for some of the things that we're talking about. So excellent. And there I see a few other ideas in the chat. Take a look. So what happened? Here we go. Okay, so thank you for listening to all our strategies. We did want to give you a little glimpse into the actual app and some of the research that we're doing with our bioscience, with our nursing students. Like we've been talking about, we really focused on trying to develop those auditory and speaking skills for them to help learn them learn the bioscience language for their academic success, but also to increase their self-confidence, because a lot of them were feeling, you know, oh, I don't know how to say that word. You know, I don't know when to say that word. You know, these are really technical medical terms. And as nurses, you know, they have to learn how to speak to the doctor as well as speak to the patient and do that a bit of that code switching as well. And a lot of them were very nervous or are very nervous about using these words out loud in the appropriate context. So this kind of gives you a glimpse into why we did what we did. And so we created an app to try to use some of these strategies that we're talking about to help the students learn their terminology, their bioscience terminology. So Carrie's going to explain a little bit about pedagogy. Love that.
Yeah, this diagram kind of summarizes what we tried to encapsulate with the app. And this was, we probably didn't achieve everything we hoped to achieve. Like, we wanted images in there for the dual coding, but in the end, our piddly little amount of money didn't quite make it. We were, you know, dreaming big, but anyway, we tried to incorporate as many of these sort of approaches in the gold area as possible. So I won't read through those. The slides will be available if anyone wants to have a close look and kind of sort of look through it. But these three levels, they're not the three tiers that we spoke about earlier. They're really probably more in alignment with Dale's approach, where we give students exposure to those words and just simple, here's the word, here's its meaning. We also, we have some other audio files in the glossary as well, so students could listen to it. Then we, in the second level, we introduced some clinical concepts, but they still had the prompts. So we're basing it on this idea that most people, when they learn a second language, they go from recognition through to production. Usually recognition comes well before we're confident in producing words either in text or in our speech. So it goes through to that third level, which doesn't have, not every question has no prompts, but there are more examples where students have to actually produce the word than in the earlier stages. And again, in clinical context, so that they're seeing, you know, how it might be used in a real life circumstance. The other thing that we have used in the second and third tiers is really trying to use different syntactical versions. So an example might be hypoxic versus hypoxia, homeostasis versus homeostatic, that kind of thing. Because students typically, when they're learning these words, struggle with the, what's the word? The different contexts of use. All right, so they're not really, they often don't get the experience of using the different versions of a word. So we've tried to include that. Can we keep moving? Just a quick look, the app has a few different things. Not all of the pages or types of screens are shown here, but you can see on the left there's easy, medium and hard. We did an introductory unit where we covered pathophysiology general terms. We also did include another quiz in the easy section on etymology, and then cardiovascular and endocrine themes were the other two topics that we covered. You can see on the front here where the glossary is, and again there's the word, its definition, but also an audio file. And what we did is we included, particularly in things like multi-choice questions, we included audio files either in the stem of the question or as responses. So students had to listen to the options and decide from audition which one was the correct sounding word. And that's the kind of thing we'll try and include. So we might keep going. And
yeah, I think I'm going to kind of skip over that part, but just let you know that we're going to show you an example of other things that we do in Moodle. But this is something that can be used in other LMSs, learning management systems. So I'm sure some of you might be using Moodle, some of you might be using Blackboard or Canvas or maybe something else. So if there is something else out there, please put it in the chat so we can learn about those other LMSs. But Carrie's going to explain some of the pedagogy that we used. Oops, I think I went too far in Moodle. But this is something that can be used in those other areas, as far as we know, in Canvas and Blackboard too.
Yeah, you can keep going to the next slide. Thanks, Michelle.
Yep.
So if we're kind of trying to originally going to see sort of what the feel is out there for different types of LMSs that you might be using. But just be aware that from what we can tell, all of those three learning management systems and probably others that are out there as well, you can insert media files. Now we've used both images in Moodle and audio files. So this is an example of a question where the stem is just written, but each of the responses is an audio file and the students have to play it and select the correct audio. If we go to the next slide, and again, you can actually do it in the stem in Moodle as well. But the other thing that is usable across all these LMSs is the H5P, and H5Ps have a variety of different formats. But one of them that I discovered well after we were into this project, and I was very excited about it, particularly as a biology teacher, you can see that I've highlighted speak the word set. So that one and the one above it, speak the words, allow students to practice speaking the word. So the first one is just speak the word, that gives you one word, but the set will give you, you can put a collection of associated terms. So when you do it, you type a question, you write in the word, and then students click on the blue one. It'll have this red button come up when they're actually speaking, and they just stop. They don't have to click anything again, and it will stop listening. And can we just click again? Once they've been assessed, it'll come up with the correct word that was entered, and they'll get a little gold star and 1 out of 1 if they got it correct. And you can see down the bottom right, I've got 4 words in this particular set, and this is the second word in that set. So you can try this not just with things like biology, but if you wanted to get students to practice using widely used tier 2 academic words as an example. Occasionally, one of the drawbacks is that it's not always accurate with biology words, at least. So it's worth checking as well, and just telling students they need to be clear in their speech. So can we keep going, Michelle?
Yeah, so so we wanted to kind of ask you to kind of wrap up a little bit. What were some of the key ideas that you got out of this? Or you can again use the chat or say it out loud. So what were some of the key things? And I know some of you have been writing some things that you're going to try this or that in your next workshop or lesson. What are some of the big ideas that you feel that you learned through this or have thought more about anyways today? Okay, well, before too many people drop out, start dropping out, or these are some of the things that we talked about today, just as a reminder and review to, really think about those sorts of meaning making and how important it is to have that contextual information and the listening and speaking, how important that is, as well as the reading and writing, and just develop those different patterns in helping the students understand. And that code switching, yeah, we talked about that. I see in the chat, context, language is a social gift, and we are definitely social people. We kind of, again, talking to, found this little funny to kind of talk about how the same words can mean very different things, and that's another skill that might often have to be taught as well. And just in those different contexts. Any questions or thoughts, final thoughts? We have about, I think, 5 more minutes. Joel?
Yeah, for me, one of the things that's always really important is to keep in mind what you're trying to say or what meaning you want to get across. And in fact, you can use language in a whole range of ways that may not be their primary or accepted usage and still get that information or meaning across to other people.
Yeah, and kind of what you're talking about too is that, again, that disciplinary language is that using certain words, we use certain words in certain disciplines for a particular purpose. And so just kind of understanding that, and that not everyone knows what those different words might mean in those different contexts. Anyone else? Oh, interesting. Anna has put a nice little link in there. Well, I just want to thank you. From my perspective, this has been a really nice chat to have with you, and I appreciate everyone participating in some way. And I hope that we can keep in touch. If you need anything or you want to talk things through, that would be great. And I wish you all well with your academic language learning and teaching.
Yeah, thanks everyone for coming. And can I just add, I have tried to, normally I can just transfer a Word document into the chat, but it's only accepting Dropbox, OneDrive, Google Drive. I don't have it quite set up in time. So perhaps, Steve, is that possible for everyone to get that emailed out? Thanks.
Yeah, Kerry, if you send it to Steve, this is Leslie, if you send it to Steve, I'll make sure it goes up on the website, if that's okay.
Steve has a copy, yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Yeah, so the PDF of the presentation and the resource handout